Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the ABCs of Canadian whiskey. My name is Britany Leach Johnson, and today I have with me both Gina and Dave, who you met last week. Gina Fossitt is the Trade and Education Brand Manager for the Corby portfolio of Canadian whiskies, and Dave Mitton is the Global Brand Ambassador, spreading all of the Canadian whiskey gospel for the Corby Canadian whiskey portfolio. Today, I know last week was so in depth that I'm sure you're probably thinking, how could there possibly be more content? But there is. Today, Dave and Gina are taking us on an academic journey from grain intake through distillation. They're going to walk us through the ins and outs of how Canadian whiskey is made, how the production style differs from other North American whiskeys, and what makes Canadian whiskey such an innovative spirit category. So we've got a lot to cover today. So make sure you come ready with your questions. But first, a few reminders. Make sure you like Camp Runamuck on Facebook. Portland Cocktail Week is our sister Facebook page, so you can jump in there too. We've got classes on both all the time. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/pdxcw, where you can catch new classes and find an archive of all of the classes we've done over the past couple of years. Make sure to follow Camp Runamuck on Instagram. While you're there, go ahead and toss the Portland Cocktail Week at PDXCW channel a follow. And for Camp Runamuck specific, applications close tonight at 11:59 p.m. So if you are interested in joining us for Camp Runamuck 2022 live and in person, make sure you fill out that form before the application closes. And one final reminder, to drop a comment, especially if you are one of our 100 students, drop a comment so we can count you as present. You can do that on YouTube. You can do it on one of the Facebook streams. We'll track it down. No worries there. And remember, if you have specific questions about maturation, we're going to cover that module on next Wednesday's class. And if you're one of the 100 students, Amy is going to be joining us in our private workshop tomorrow afternoon, where we are going to get so deep into all of this production stuff. So there may be some questions that you present today that we might save because Amy's planning on covering that tomorrow. And with all of that, I am going to stop talking so the people you want to see can start talking.
Thanks, Britany, and welcome back, everyone. We're so excited to be here, and I sincerely mean that. Like, we were overwhelmed with the response from last week, and the amount of questions. You're also engaged. It's just incredible. So this week, we're going to dive into the biggest questions I always get from traveling around the world. Is I realize that Canadian whiskey is one of the world's most misunderstood spirit categories. Gina is going to take you through production from when grain arrives at the distillery right up until maturation. As Britany mentioned, we'll dive deep into that next week. For the 100 students, yes, I have seen what Amy is going to be speaking about tomorrow, and I'm excited. I'm going to learn some things that I didn't even know. It's going to be incredible. So just as a reminder, today I'll be walking us through, at the end of class, our two single grains, the JP Weiser's 18-year-old and the lot number 40. So get your glasses ready for that. Get your pens and notebooks ready, because Gina Fossitt is about to take you on a journey.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Yes, here we go into the journey. Before we get into the journey of production, though, I do want to address one question that came up and was brought to our attention last week about wheat being brought to Canada. We noted that, the English brought wheat as a grain to Canada. And really, when we're talking about that, it's in historical reference, we're really referring to the context of Canadian whiskey history. And so, someone had asked, well, I looked it up and there was wheat being grown in Canada before you said the English migrated. That is true. The wheat was being grown a little bit in Canada before the mass migration, but there were also a few Englishmen and women in Canada before we really talked about that mass migration last week. We were really referring to, how that affected the Canadian whiskey category and what eventually became the traditional style of Canadian whiskey, you know, with them bringing more hybrids of the grain, their knowledge in growing the grain, and their abilities to distill the grain, and that leading to being the first commercially distilled grain. So I just wanted to clarify and clear that up a little bit. But now, this week, we are excited to head into whiskey production, specifically, of course, Canadian whiskey production. So this picture here that you see is from the top of the grain silos at Hiram Walker. This is part of the distillery. It is a massive production site. So it's very difficult to capture in one photograph, but this is part of it, certainly. We're going to get into the distillery specifically today because we're using Hiram Walker as our example to show you different production styles throughout Canada, and different ways that Canadians are distilling. Of course, this isn't every single way of production or technique, but Hiram Walker, because it's such a massive site, does have the abilities and does produce whiskey in many different styles. So we have the ability, we're very lucky to show you, you know, some things that are happening on very large scale, and also some things that are happening on very small batch craft scales as well. So this is a picture of Hiram Walker. What we're going to go through today is grain intake, getting that grain from the fields to the distillery, milling it down and having our grist, cooking it, adding our ingredients for the cook, having that mash, going into fermentation where we add our yeast, then having a beer with some alcohol that we can start distilling, having a spirit after distillation. Remember, Canadians do not have any white whiskeys. Whiskey must be 3 years old to be a Canadian whiskey. So after distillation, we do have a spirit. And then today we're not going to go into maturation. Like Britany said, save those questions for next week. We're not going into blended whiskey today. That's week 4. We're just going through distillation. Now, just to go back to Hiram Walker, it is one of the largest distilleries in North America. So just to give you a little more insight into this distillery and what we'll be looking at, we have an awesome video that we've put together for you to show you the scope of the distillery. So here we go. All right. So again, just showing you scope, right? Size of this distillery and what Hiram Walker is really capable of. You don't need to memorize all those stats, but it's really just showing you, again, a size of production. So looking at it again, just in print, just to take it all in, we have 19 grain silos. They're massive. Like I said, this photograph was taken on top of the grain silos. 100,000 metric ton of corn is being taken in a year and 10,000 metric ton of rye. And we're using a hammer mill, like most North American whiskeys would, to mill down the grain, opposed to a roller mill, which Amy's going to get into tomorrow, the differences of those milling styles. When we look at fermentation at Hiram Walker specifically, there's 39 fermentation tanks that stand 4 stories high. You're going to get a look at these a little bit later in the class today, but we can't even capture all these in one shot. The room is massive, as you can imagine, but they are all hard at work every single day. And then distillation styles at Hiram Walker, there's 3 main distillation styles happening for whiskey production, and these are really the 3 biggest ones throughout Canada as well. Of course, there's other styles of distillation and other styles of stills, combo stills, etc. But these are really your most commonly used styles of distillation, which would be a single column distillation, much like most of your big house bourbons or ryes would be produced. Double column distillation, like we talked about last week with the Riley patent with Guterham and Worts. That Riley still really changing the style of that traditional style, very soft and light of Canadian whiskey. And then a column still and a batch of that going into a small pot distillation. And we're going to get into all of these a little bit later, but Hiram Walker is distilling about 180,000 liters per day. Again, just trying to give you scope here. Our warehouses are called the Pike Creek warehouses, and although we're not talking about maturation today, I will tell you there are over 1.6 million barrels of whiskey aging in those warehouses every single day. So really exciting stuff. We're going to go inside the distillery with some video footage and take a look at everything. So first, let's look at our ingredients going into whiskey. Our grains: corn, wheat, rye, barley. Pick your grain: quinoa, oats. If it's a cereal grain, we can make whiskey out of it. Now, here's the big take home. All of these grains in Canada, primarily speaking, okay, that it's not regulated that they produce whiskey this way, but primarily speaking, most distilleries are going to produce the grains separately. So at 100% grain builds, the corn is going to be milled, cooked, fermented, distilled, and aged. And then we have a corn whiskey. Same with wheat, rye, barley. Everything is at 100% grain builds. And then, we have variations of these. So we have many different styles of corn or wheat whiskeys or rye whiskeys in the warehouses based on, fermentation time and temperature. Was nitrogen added to the process? What type of still was used and what flavor compounds are coming to life or being stripped away? What type of wood are we using for maturation? Because remember, in Canada, you don't have to use brand new oak. You could use all types of different wood. So now we have many different styles of each of these grains at 100% grain builds for the master blender to work with and create new flavor profiles and new bottlings at the end of the day. So looking at the grains and what they really impart into the whiskey. When we look at corn, it imparts more sweet, creamy notes. Wheat is going to give us those toasty, bready notes. Rye is going to give us those big, bold, peppery spice notes. And then barley is going to give us kind of a nutty character and a little bit of backbone when we add it to a blend. At Hiram Walker specifically, these grains are being sourced as locally as possible. Now, there's a very high bar to meet when it comes to quality of grains at Hiram Walker. So I say sourced as locally as possible because, we mostly work with local Ontario farmers. We have one generational farming family that has been bringing grain to the distillery since it opened in 1858, which is pretty magical to have a relationship like that. But, there are years that there are things out of anyone's control that affect the quality of grain coming in. For instance, weather. A few years back, it was super rainy in the area, and there just wasn't enough of high quality rye coming in. And so the distillery had to source rye from Michigan. Now, we say source locally Ontario as much as possible. Michigan is right across the river. So if we're looking at proximity, it's still pretty local, but it is another country, and so we will source our grains, out as far as we need to maintain the quality. That is not something, we're willing to let go. But we certainly work with farmers in the area to be local. And it's more economical, shipping grain in truckloads across the country. It doesn't economically make sense if you don't have to. It's very expensive to do that. So it just economically also makes sense to source locally. So the grain comes in, so you can see kind of what happens here in a bed of, on a truck bed. And we have this probe that goes down into the grain all the way to the bottom of the truck bed. And it's going to take samples from different layers of the truck. Now, this is so we can ensure that there's no faulty grain or poor quality grain layered in there. Once we take the samples, they come inside to Alice there, who does some quality checks on this. She's going to check for moisture content, weight. Is there any foreign materials mixed in with the grain? Is the grain cracked open? How well does it grind down into a grist? But there's some really important ones that she does without machines, that her human senses. She's trained very well to do this. And it's really, she just uses her nose to smell the grain. Is it fresh? Does it smell like fresh grain? Or does it have like a mustiness to it? That mustiness would be geosmin, a compound that can technically be distilled out, but you lose so much yield by doing that it's financially not worth doing that. And so if she accepts a truckload that has geosmin in it, years down the line, Dr. Don and Amy are going to be dealing with a problem, a major, major expensive problem in the whiskey, and what to do with that. And you can see here the grain being offloaded. It does pour down into those grates, and then there's a conveyor belt system taking it to the silos. She's also going to check for vomitoxin, another toxic compound. I'm going to let Amy talk about that in more detail tomorrow. I know she's getting into that one pretty deep, so I'm going to leave that one to Amy. But, lots of quality checks happening on that grain as quickly as possible, because sometimes Alice has 10 truckloads to check in one day during the busy season. So, lots of quality checks done, but as quickly as they possibly can be done. Okay, so we've got our grain. We've milled it down to a grist. What's going in when we mix all of the ingredients before we're making this whiskey? We've got our grains at Hiram Walker. We're producing corn, wheat, rye, barley, malted rye, and malted barley. We're also milling down the grain, like I said, with a hammer mill. This is very common in North American whiskeys. So this is the hammer mill. It's going to mill it with the outside of the grain, the kernels as well. And you could see Dave pouring a little bit of that grist. It's kind of like a coarse flour in consistency. So that's going into our premix tank here, as well as enzymes. Now, I did say 100% grain builds, which means most of our whiskeys aren't going to have malted barley in them. where we would have enzymes to help the fermentation process along. So we are using some exogenous enzymes, and these are enzymes that are cultivated in a lab, much like yeast would be, but they're going to really help the fermentation process get started. And we're going to dive into that in a little bit deeper, but our enzymes are going in. Water, of course. The water source at Hiram Walker is the Great Lakes watershed. And if you look, on this map down here, on the western side of Lake Erie, just north, you can see this little river. That's the Detroit River. That's where Hiram Walker sits on the Canadian side. Detroit is right across the river there. That's where we're pulling the water from. We're also adding backstillage or sour mash. Again, very common in North American whiskeys. This is really the sludge at the bottom of the still. So after distillation, what happens to that sludge that's left over? A few things. One of them is that some of it goes into the next batch called backstillage, sour mash. Some people might call it backset, but that's going into the next batch. And what that's going to do is balance out the pH levels, as well as keep it consistent from batch to batch. That it keeps a very consistent product right from the start, which is very important. Now, another thing that happens to those, that sludge, I'm going to call it, at the bottom of the still is that it gets turned into distillers' dried grains and wet distillers' grains as well for animal feed. We're not going to get into that today. Again, Amy, our distiller and manufacturing manager, is going to cover that tomorrow. So we'll leave that one for tomorrow's conversation. And then finally, we're also adding nitrogen at different parts of the process, starting here in the pre-mix tank. So nitrogen, when we think about it, it's kind of like adding nitrogen to your yard or your lawn to help your grass grow. Nitrogen is going to help the yeast during fermentation multiply and grow more quickly. And if you do it in the right amounts, at the right times, you can really maximize your yields. For instance, we're not into fermentation yet, but from our fermentation, they have been able to get the corn ABV up to the beer up to 15-16%, which is very high for a beer coming off fermentation. So, the right amount of nitrogen at the right times, again, can really help your yeast multiply and grow. Okay, so with these 5 ingredients, we now have our mash, and we're ready to go into our cook. And just to show you a little bit before we go into that cook, we've got all these pipes. Here's that pre-mix tank. All these things are coming in through many, 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 many pipes through the distillery, mixed in that tank, going through many more pipes. And here are the batch cookers that we're going to talk about momentarily. This is the top of those batch cookers. You can also see them on ground level here in a moment. But we just really want to give you, insight and an inside look at all of this equipment and how it all comes together in each step of the process. So you can see those batch cookers there. And this is where we're going to cook that mash, heat it up. Okay, so cooking. We just saw those cookers. What's happening in there? Well, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see starch under a microscope. I stole these from Dr. John, of course, but these photos, so our starch under a microscope. And you can see as it heats up, the starch expands or swells, okay? And it's going to swell so much that it's going to eventually pop open. A common analogy for this is popcorn. It's just like popcorn popping open. Once it's popped open, now the enzymes have access to these starch strains. Why do they need access? These starch strains are gigantic. They are very, very large. And this is the food for the yeast that we are about to add in fermentation. But the starch strains at this point are too large for the yeast to eat. So the enzymes, their job is to break apart these starch chains, to break them down into smaller chains or even single units like sugar molecules to feed the yeast. So then they can start to multiply and grow. They eat the starch and they excrete many different things. We're going to get into that in a second for fermentation. So once the mash is cooled, we go to the fermentation tanks. Like I said, we have 39 of them at Hiram Walker. They stand 4 stories high. This is the top of some of them. We're trying to give you a view as many of them as possible. This is actually looking up. So these are the bottoms of those tanks, which is a very rare view. It's very rare that you get to see the bottoms of all of this equipment. But just to, again, give you insight to what's really happening here. So fermentation is where we add the yeast, and he's about to do that. It's a powdered yeast that he's going to add here. Once it gets added to the mash and starts to eat that starch, those starch chains or smaller units or sugar molecules, it's going to bubble. That means it's in action. It's growing. It's doing its thing and excreting many things. Most people understand that the yeast, gives us alcohol, carbon dioxide, and heat, but it also gives us a lot of flavor into our whiskeys. So what's developed here are fruity notes, floral, green grassy compounds, soapy notes, and even sulfur notes. Now there's Amy that we'll all be talking to tomorrow. She is pulling out a sample for Dave there of the beer, and you can see how bubbly it really is on top. And she's pouring that, and it's really, when you look at it, there's a lot of, it's grainy. There's grains in there. You can see that. It's kind of like a very thin porridge or very thin oatmeal consistency, super thin. So fermentation, this is where we add our yeast and start to make alcohol and all those flavor compounds that we want to capture into our whiskey. Okay, so distillation styles. We're going to dive into 3, like I talked about. So we start with our beer. We're going to look at single column distillation first. So here's the still house. And this is our beer still, we're going to call it. It's 5 stories high. It's 100% copper. Now it looks like there's some stainless steel there on the outside. That is insulation around the still. It gets extraordinarily hot and people are working very close to it. So it is insulated. All of our stills are actually. But you can see in this photo, now this photo is a very small portion of the still because it's difficult to capture 5 stories of a still in a photograph. But just to show you, there's all of these circular doors in a column still. And on each level of these doors is a plate, a copper plate in our stills that has a lot of little holes in it. And at the top of the still, the beer is going to go in, and your heat source for distillation, your steam, is going to come in the bottom. So the beer is going to seep down through those holes. The steam is going to come up, and there's like a mini distillation now happening at each plate of this still, 5 stories high. Okay. And you're going to get different flavor notes coming off at different temperatures, and each plate is at a little bit different temperature, further away from the heat source. So a lot going on in this column still. Now, Amy is going to open up one of these doors and show us the inside. Luckily, this video shoot was happening when she was cleaning the still. Lucky for us, we get to look inside. So here you can see this copper plate with all the little holes in it. And that is where the beer is going to seep down through the steam coming up through those holes as well for the distillation. Copper, hugely important in distillation. Not all stills are copper though. And that's good to note. You don't have to have a copper still. But copper is going to absorb the sulfur and turn it into copper sulfate. So it's really going to remove those sulfur notes. Nobody wants to taste whiskey with sulfur notes or smell sulfur before they drink something, right? So you want to remove as much of that as possible. And when you have 100% copper stills, you're able to do that at a higher rate. Now, if you don't have 100% copper still, you could add copper wiring at the top. You could have just copper plates. You could have all kinds of ways to add copper to your distillation at different parts of it. But copper being extremely important here. And here's a few photos as well as just some other plates. When I was at Vendôme, I was lucky enough to see some plates that were just going to be instilled into a still. And so you can see those there outside of the still. So what do we end up with at the end of a single column distillation? We end up with a full-bodied whiskey, very flavorful, right? Retaining the grain character. So whether it's corn or wheat or rye or barley, we're going to retain, that sweetness, that creaminess from the corn or the spiciness from the rye. Also retaining most of the yeast character. So those fruity notes, floral, green grassy, soapy notes, retaining most of that. Hopefully we are not retaining the sulfur. That is the goal, no sulfur. And at Hiram Walker, we're bringing this distillation up to a 70% ABV. Okay, so now let's take a look at double column distillation. First going through that same beer still we just looked at, and then through a second column distillation, second column still, excuse me. There on the right, it is again 5 stories high. You can see a different angle here. We can get a better view of this one. And it is 100% copper again, fully insulated on the outside. But this is really referring to that lighter style, because after double column distillation, once you go through that second distillation, now you're stripping out a lot of that grain character. Now you're stripping out a lot of that yeast character, and you're left with a very light style, which you're going to see Dr. Don here hold a sample of. That light, softer style that Canadians really, it became very traditional style of Canadian whiskey, and an iconic style of Canadian whiskey. That is your double column distilled whiskey. And, what you end up here, like I said, light style, often used as a base whiskey in blends, but sometimes bottled on its own as well, not as a base whiskey, but to show off something else. So we don't have the grain character to show off. We don't have the yeast character to show off, but we may want to show off or feature maturation in some way, shape, or form. And this is a really great whiskey to do that in. And to highlight maturation on its own. So again, stripping that grain character, stripping that yeast character, and this now we're going from the 70% ABV through the second distillation is going to come up to 94, sometimes a little over 94 there, but 94 ABV out of the second still. Okay, finally, we're going to look at pot distillation. So at Hiram Walker, we're first going through that beer still again, and then taking a batch of that to a pot still. So this is actually a combo still that we use for experimental purposes. The Lot 40 still here is the main pot still that we would use for whiskey distillation. Again, it's 100% copper, fully insulated. And the distillation is super slow on this. So we're talking 12-hour distillations through the pot still. And what that's really doing, before I get into that, he's going to show you the inside of the still here. I don't want to miss that. So at the bottom of these pot stills are these coils. That's your heat source. It's a lot like cooking a pot of soup on a stove, right? The heat source is at the bottom. The vapors, as it heats up, different flavors and different aromas are coming off of your soup. Same thing for pot distillation. At different temperatures, different compounds, different flavor compounds are going to evaporate off the liquid. Now, when you slow down that distillation to a 12-hour distillation, and just to give you kind of a comparison here, if you look at single malt Scotch, being pot distilled. And I'm going to speak generally here because every distillery is very different in their process. But generally, you're going to see most distilleries doing a pot distillation somewhere between 4 and 7 or 8 hours, somewhere in there. That's kind of the common range. When you slow this down to 12 hours and you've got that insulated still to hold those temperatures a little bit longer, you're able to have the vapors coming off slower, and the distiller is able to make more accurate cut points, because it's not just, okay, green light go for methanol, stop, green light go for ethyl acetate, stop. It kind of runs into each other a little bit, and so the slower that you can do that, the more accurate cut points you can make and really concentrate up the flavor notes in the whiskey that you want. So with the pot still, we are able to concentrate specific flavors by making those cut points. You can make cut points on column distillation, and some people do. Most commonly, though, people don't. Distilleries or producers most commonly don't make cut points, but it is done in some places in the industry. And here for the pot distillation, we're coming up to about an 80% ABV. Okay, finally, one last visual to really drive it home on how Canadian whiskey is produced, and how it really stands out and is unique and different than other styles, specifically American whiskey. When we look at Canadian whiskey and we look at the recipe creation, and I'm talking about the grain recipe here, it's really happening after maturation. When we look at the US, that recipe creation is happening at the beginning of the process, during the cook, where, your mash bill is being made. How much corn, how much rye, how much wheat, barley, whatever, is going to be in this whiskey. And then taking that mash bill, putting it all the way through the process and having one whiskey, versus in Canada, taking each grain through separately, having all these different whiskeys to play around with at the end. So just, a couple of examples. One bottling might have corn whiskey, rye whiskey, wheat whiskey in it. You could bottle up 100% rye, one distillate. Or you can make a very layered, complex blend with some of that double column distilled corn, 2 different rye distillates. You could play around with the rye grain in the hybrid of grain, the distillation style, types of wood, same for wheat, barley, really layering the flavors and making a complex blend. Generally speaking, in the US, again, not regulated that whiskey is produced in the US this way, but generally speaking, for bourbons, especially, and ryes, we're going to generally see the same mash bill. Not always. We could blend different mash bills if they're both bourbons or both ryes, but we'll talk about that in the blended whiskey section in week 4. But generally, we're going to see the same mash bill, same wood type, because it's required to have a brand new American oak for bourbon or rye, going into a bottling, several barrels of it. And, maybe it's blending different ages or different parts of where they're sitting in the warehouse. But generally speaking, when we're talking about a recipe, we quite often see the same whiskey being bottled into one bottling. So that brings us to who, kind of is the face of the distillery, or the brands, the whiskeys in which countries. And now this is opinion, but we really feel like the master blender is in Canada, because recipe creation happening at the end. That's the blender's job. Where in the US, we tend to, market the master distiller. Again, recipe creation happening toward the beginning of the process. So just one way to look at it, but really, driving home that in Canada, the grains are produced separately. Okay, so that brings us to the end of whiskey production slides. Now we are going to get to taste some wonderful whiskeys with Dave. He's going to take us through J.P. Weiser's 18 years old and Lot 40, both really great examples of single grain, single distillates being bottled. All yours, Dave.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks, Professor Fossitt. That's my new nickname for Gina. And I think it suits her very well. So yeah, nice little, I mean, I would call that normally a deep dive into the beginning of production of Canadian whiskey. And for the 100 students, wait until you get a load of Amy tomorrow. I'm going to have my notebook out. But as Gina said, we're going to try 2 whiskeys right now. The students that have their samples at home, for those that don't, this is what the bottle looks like on a shelf, the J.P. Weiser's 18. And Gina kind of hinted at it earlier, where she was talking about how the first run column distillation, leaves that full-bodied, retains all the grain and yeast character. But the second column distillation strips away a lot of that grain and yeast character, and it's a light-styled whiskey. And sometimes there's more of a focus on what maturation does. J.P. Weiser's 18 is a great example of that. So the 2 whiskeys we're trying today, we will be drinking later on in the course, so do not have it all today. Now, today is about single grains. So it's very simple in the sense that J.P. Weiser's 18, it's 100% corn whiskey. And as we discussed last week, traditional style Canadian whiskey is generally most soft corn with a little bit of rye added to it to add some spice and body. This being 100% soft corn whiskey on its own, aged in ex-Canadian whiskey casks, and that brings out, it emphasizes grain and yeast characteristics such as mature oak, autumn florals, spice, some caramel and toffee. This right now, it's got a beautiful kind of light amber color to it. On the nose, I get lots of almost vanilla cedar. You get those autumn florals we were talking about, a little bit of fresh pine, and certainly mature oak. The youngest blend in this whiskey is 18 years. Now, at first sip, this is certainly, I would say, probably the softest, lightest whiskey out of all of our expressions. It's extremely smooth. You get a lot of that mature oak on it. I get hints of baked apples. I get green apples, a little bit of rich caramel, even a touch of citrus to it. We often say the green apple, which we're going to talk about down the line on maturation, but there is a reason we do get green apple. If you don't, you're not wrong. It's just what the average person gets off of this. When it comes to drinking this, obviously it's our famous tagline, we never want to tell you how to drink your whiskey, but we can recommend. And this is one that we recommend sipping neat on its own. Obviously, if you like a little bit of water or a block of ice to keep it chilled is great. Pretty rare I come across anyone who makes me a cocktail with this. Not that it wouldn't make a beautiful drink, it's just a higher price range. And it's probably, don't quote me because every market's different, but around the $70 mark. And the reason I even bring this up right now is because I've found, even back when I used to sell this at restaurants before I worked for this company, you know how your menus work. If you've got a lineup of whiskeys with age statements for your average consumer, if you've got a lineup of Glenlivet scotches, 12, 15, 18, a lot of people will gravitate towards the older age statement thinking that it's better, which that's not always the case. Depends what style and whiskey you like, how it's been made. J.P. Weiser's 18 being such an easy price at under $100, most 18-year-old whiskeys, I'm going to assume in whatever market you're in, are always up close to the $200 mark. So I think sometimes people will see the 18-year-old and how the price is not extremely high and think there's got to be something wrong. Fact of the matter is we just have so much whiskey, as Gina mentioned, 1.6 million barrels laying down. And we'll get into maturation later. But yes, we do have an angel share of 3% every year. And that equates to about 48,000 barrels of whiskey that go missing every year, the angels drink. So think about that. I hope you're enjoying this 18-year-old. It's a lovely sipper and one of my favorites. Guess any questions about that right now before we dive into the Lot 40?
It's also such a soft whiskey that, you know, a lot of people who, especially Americans, we find, you know, like bigger, heavier, grain-forward whiskeys, where this is such a light, soft style of whiskey that it can kind of be like a shocker, you know, like, whoa, what is that? You know?
It's a great point. And I mean, it's even if you're thinking of when you've got a consumer that comes to your bar, a guest has joined you, and maybe they want a traditional style Canadian whiskey and they ask for it. They ask for a big brand name, but you don't have that. This is something those types of drinkers would like. To be quite honest, I've shown this off over in the UK quite a bit, and big Scotch and Irish whiskey drinkers have really been drawn towards this, like just easy sipping, light style.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we should, what are we good here? Did you mention the distillation method for the JP Weiser's 10-year? Oh, someone's asking about the 10-year-olds. I like that. Oh, 18-year. Okay. Thought somebody was seeing the future. Yes, the JP Weiser's 18-year-old. It's that double column distillation. So first run takes away all the harsh qualities out, and the second column distillation takes away a lot of the big flavors from the grain and yeast and leave that light, soft base whiskey. Hopefully that answers it.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of more questions specific to this product. We have many questions overall that we'll get to after Dave takes us through our next product. And some of these you might be like, we're actually going to talk about that in maturation. Someone asked, what type of cask are used for the JP Weiser's 18-year? And if that's something we're going to cover in the next module, then we'll just move on.
I'll tell you, I mean, the answer is we use ex-Canadian whiskey casks. And yes, we're going to cover that greatly in the next module. We will be getting to I can't steal Dr. Don's thunder. And who better to tell you than Dr. Don, the doctor of maturation.
Dave, I love you, but you couldn't steal Dr. Don's thunder if you tried.
Oh, please.
We're all fully obsessed with Dr. Don, as you can see over here in these parts. And a couple more questions about this product. So nothing additional is added to the product as far as the 9.09 rule goes.
No, this one is, I mean, when I talk next about the Lot 40, this is kind of as straight as it gets. It is that 100% corn grain. It is double column distilled. It's aged in the ex-Canadian whiskey casks. And that's it. I mean, youngest blend in the bottles, 18-year. Dr. Don has told me, you know, it varies, but I mean, the oldest distillate you're going to get in there is probably 19, 20 years old, depending. But yeah, it is our one example of 100% corn whiskey. And that's that. Very simple.
Fantastic. And then the last question on this product, which I feel like is just another opportunity to sing Dr. Don's praises. This question says, it says blended on the label, but you state it's a single distillate?
It's a single grain. So there will be, I mean, all of our whiskeys are blended. So JP Weiser's 18, there's going to be several distillates of corn whiskey, all double column distilled, aged in ex-Canadian whiskey casks, blended together. And same goes for Lot 40, which we'll get into in a moment.
That can be really confusing, the way that we talk about it, because we can easily get very internal on our speak. And, you know, I was also saying this during the presentation of like, you know, when we say a distillate, it means a specific whiskey. So single distillate, what we're kind of meaning here is that a single grain, one distillation style, but it's different cask being blended, you know, same cask type, but possibly different ages, with the youngest being 18. It's not a single cask of whiskey.
So another difference between American whiskey and Canadian whiskey. So this is not something that is all run through the still together and then rested in barrels together. This is, if it's single distillate for Canadian whiskey, it's just like, that means that this is all corn or this is all rye, correct?
And the same distillation style.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to get out of the way so we can taste our lot 40, but get ready. We've got plenty of good questions afterwards.
All right. And for next, everyone's got their sample. And if you're not familiar with the bottle, this is actually, I should be clear. This is the latest label of lot 40, which I don't think it's in the US yet, but it will be coming your way once everyone has drank the old label. But it's the same liquid inside. Marketing just upgraded. We just put that it was 100% rye in the bottle, pot distilled, aged in new oak, which this is exactly what it is. As the JP Weiser's 18 was very simple in the fact that it's 100% corn whiskey, this is 100% rye whiskey. And to put how it's made, basically it is 100% unmalted rye grain. We call them distill it once. And again, that takes a lot of the harsh qualities away, but leaves all the big robust flavors in the grain and yeast characteristics. And then we pot distill it afterwards. And as Gina was speaking, it concentrates up all the notes of the rye grain. We discard of the heads and the tails, and that is the heads get the green, the green grass pine notes. The tails have the soapy. We discard of those, and we just keep the hearts, which is all that beautiful rye grain, citrus and floral notes. But as everyone knows, rye grain is the biggest and boldest of all the grains. So to tame this beast, as I always say, we lay it down in brand new American oak. And this really rounds it out, smooths it out, softens it up, gives it a lot of vanilla and toffee flavors. Now, the way this came to be, Lot 40 does have a little bit of a history. In the late 90s, when pretty much any Canadian whiskey you can think of being made back then was traditional style, majority soft corn with a little pinch of rye added to it. We thought, why not take that little bit of rye added to our traditional whiskey and bottle it on its own? So the idea to make 100% rye whiskey, which right now we all hear and we're like, that sounds like a great idea. To put it in perspective, you know, the late 90s is when I was starting to bartend as a young fella. And I was one of those people who wanted to travel and see the world. And the one thing in common, whether you're in Sydney, Australia, Los Angeles, Halifax, Nova Scotia, you would find cocktails made in glasses shaped like this. They were neon colored, they were juicy, they were fruity, they were usually vodka based. You didn't see your average consumer really drinking whiskey. It was kind of considered something your uncle or grandfather would drink. And it wasn't 100% rye whiskeys. So when we released 100% rye whiskey to the world in the late 90s, it didn't do so well. It was a little too big for people's palates. It was definitely ahead of the curve. Now you fast forward to the early 2000s when bartenders in New York City and London, UK start digging out old cocktail books from the late 1800s, early 1900s, as we learned last week, and they start bringing back boozy stirred classics, and they start to grow popularity. And, you know, other cities around the world start following suit. And all of a sudden, you know, those neon colored juicy cocktails are replaced by martinis, Manhattans, old fashions. People want the classics coming back. Someone at our company thought, hey, what if we take that 100% rye whiskey that didn't do so well a decade ago and re-release it? Dr. Don Livermore was our brand new master blender at that time, and he took a shot at it, and he made that once column and pot distilled 100% rye whiskey and aged it in brand new oak. And the year it was released, I believe the second year after, it won Canadian Whiskey of the Year. And it's won many accolades, and it's the one whiskey we find behind many bars around the world. Now, grabbing your glass, because I'm talking too much, it is a deep, rich amber color. You cannot deny that. On the nose, you'll often hear people say they get sour rye bread, and it's you almost get like a little fruit. Some people say they get pears off of it. I get a little bit of warm honey. I get a lot of rich vanilla. And I get some of those floral notes we were talking about. Now, when you think of 100% rye, you don't think of it as a sipping whiskey. You think of it to use in classic cocktails. But sipping this, it's certainly a much bigger and a little more complex whiskey compared to the J.P. Weiser's 18 that we just had. But it's got a soft, sweet, elegant side to it. Being 100% rye grain, it works perfectly in your classic cocktails. If you have someone that wants an old fashioned or a Manhattan, for me, this is the way to go. If I'm sitting at your bar anytime in the future, anyone that knows me, the way to my heart is giving me 100% rye old fashioned. It holds up against herbal liqueurs and big vermouths if you're making classics like Diamondbacks or Vieux Carrés. But with its soft, elegant side, we have been very pleased to see in different places around the US or the world, bartenders using it even in the warmer summer months and doing tall, refreshing cocktails. This pairs perfectly with sherries and citrus and all kinds of different bubbles. And it works great in summery by the pool cocktails.
Okay. We do have some questions about this product. I think some of them are more like clarification questions. Also, a lot of folks are talking about notes they picked up or things that they are enjoying with their Lot 40 currently, which includes dark chocolate. I saw peaches. Someone was like, oh, I pick up some fennel here. So everyone who has access to the products right now is really enjoying the tasting time with you, Dave. And then we had one question. Can you let us know how long the Lot 40 is aged? I know that we're blending, so.
Absolutely. Now, remember, to be Canadian whiskey, the minimum amount of time has to be 3 years. Generally, Lot 40, it's usually a blend. I'd say you're safe to say like oldest blend in there is about 5 years.
Perfect. And then another, I think this is a clarification question. J.P. Weiser's 18 years. It's double distilled. Is the Lot 40 rye done only in the pot still?
It is yes, the J.P. Weiser's is double column distilled. So think of that as kind of stripping away. And then the Lot 40, it's first distilled in the column distilled. So it strips away any harsh characteristics, but leaves all the grain and yeast characteristics in the whiskey. And then it's pot distilled afterwards, which concentrates up a lot of the rye grain.
Fantastic. Well, are y'all ready to dive into some of our other questions?
Sure.
Let's do it.
I tried to keep them separated by category because we had so much information in this presentation that I was like, if we just put this in here, we're going to get lost. So there were a couple of questions that came through that I am fairly certain will be covered in the maturation portion. One was a question about oak, and the other one was a question about temperature variations. Are we good to just wait until next week for those?
I saw some of those questions come in. The one temperature, I believe the temperature variations was based on nitrogen and when it's added and how much.
That one's in our fermentation section. This one was kind of at the beginning when you were showing the video and it looked really cold, I guess. And they were wondering about the temperature variations, what role they play in the entire process. But if that's something we're covering next week, then we'll wait till next week. If not, we'll get into it now. Next
week is good. We're diving into that next week.
We'll give you something to think about. Yeah, it's in the most southern tip of Canada, so it does get warm. In the summer months, it's like 35 degrees Celsius, which is about 95 Fahrenheit. So it gets very warm. It gets as hot as Kentucky does, to be quite honest. But there are times of the year where it becomes minus 40 Celsius, and that is where Celsius and Fahrenheit meet. So that would mean negative 40 Fahrenheit. It gets very warm and very cold. But Dr. Dawn and Gina are going to dive into that next week.
You are all brave souls. I don't know if I would survive. I would have to, Dave. I'd have to make you take me coat shopping to make sure I survived a negative 40 anything.
Just the right hats and jackets. That's all.
We're just gonna have to go shopping so I can come visit.
And please, that's also an extreme thing. It's not like that all the time in the winter, but it can get that cold.
I'm going to hold you to that. So kind of going back towards the beginning of the presentation and starting with grain. Gina, you briefly mentioned like kind of offhandedly quinoa, but is that something that could be used in Canadian whiskey since it's technically a pseudo cereal grain and not a true cereal grain?
Off the top of my head, yes, because I've heard of people distilling that, but by regulation, let's ask Amy tomorrow because she will have the fine details of that regulation, seeing that she works, very closely on grain intake and all of what is not only required, but allowed. So let's double check that with Amy tomorrow.
Perfect. And then our next grain-related question is what varieties of corn are you using, and are any of those boutique varieties of corn?
That is also an Amy question for tomorrow. I love these questions.
I can't wait until we get to see Amy tomorrow. I feel like she's going to come in and everybody's going to be like, hey, so I have questions for you from yesterday before you even get started.
We warned her that was going to happen.
So moving into kind of the mash beer fermentation section of what we've covered today. Someone asked, and this was kind of earlier in the presentation, and I know you addressed this, but I think it might be worth just reiterating because I know we have some people who have to take quizzes by Tuesday of next week. So when do you use malted grains in the mash? Is that sometimes, always, never?
Rare, but used. There are a few products and blends that, in fact, Lot 40 used to have malted grain in it. Like Dave was saying, that the original recipe was about 10% malted rye. And then Dr. Don removed the malted rye and it's 100% unmalted rye. But they're still making whiskeys with malted rye and malted barley. And they're using those in various blends, but in smaller amounts. Dave, can you remember really any whiskey really highlighting either of the malted grains from Hiram Walker?
Not since my time, but I've only been there 8 years and just been there a lot longer than I have. So, I mean, Don's going to geek out on some history, and Don's going to geek out on how he has yeast strains from the late 1800s. And he's going to be able to dive into a lot of that stuff, and he'll know, because he studies a lot of the old recipes.
Mm-hmm.
I also can't wait to see Dr. Don. We've got such an exciting lineup coming. So we kind of have a cluster of questions about beer. So I'm going to try to piece them together so we can cover all of the parts of beer. Is the beer that you all produce similar to ancient gruel beers?
I don't know. I'm not familiar. Dave?
Right. I know Amy was watching on Facebook, so right now she's just sitting there writing all the questions down. She's like, oh, God. I'm not even going to be able to talk tomorrow. She's just going to be answering questions.
But, she just throws the whole presentation away and is like, all right, rapid fire, let's do this.
It's a great question because Gina and I don't have an answer, but we will, as last week, make sure we get an answer for you.
Fantastic. And just so y'all know, if there's anything that we don't cover here that seems pressing that we know Dr. Don or Amy aren't going to cover in upcoming sessions, Dave and Gina have access to those, which is how you got some answers in your Facebook group. So don't sweat it. More on beer, though, quickly. Are there any solids filtered out of the beer? Like at any point in the process? No?
No, so they're really putting the entire, the mash is going into fermentation. and what comes out of that is going into the still. They're not filtering any of that out like you might see in Scotch, an Irish whiskey.
Yeah.
You'll see a lot of that filtering out before distillation. That's not happening at Hiram Walker. And honestly, for the most part, it's not happening in North American whiskeys in general.
Fantastic. There's your answer to that one. So one more beer question, then we're going to move on. Can you briefly, because I know that this can be, I think a broad overview is good kind of across all whiskeys, but I know things can change from producer to producer. The difference for you in the beer versus the back stillage.
Oh, so the beer is going to contain, it's let's take corn. I'm going to take one grain as an example. So making a beer from corn, at Hiram Walker, like I said earlier, they're able to get that ABV up to 15, 16%. The flavoring grains, they're bringing up to around 8 or 9%, like rye, barley, wheat. But the beer then is going into the still, obviously, let's say column distillation, falling down that column still. Vapors are being taken off. So the alcohol is being concentrated, flavor compounds coming off at different temperatures, coming off, but there's still some like stuff left, the solids, the liquid is left. We're capturing the vapors. And then that's going into a condenser, which we really didn't get into. I know Amy's going to touch on that tomorrow a little bit, but those vapors are going into a condenser to turn those vapors back into a liquid. And that's what eventually becomes your whiskey. But at the bottom, there's still all those solids that has those grain particles, water, and other things in that has a lot of nutrients, like I said, for animal feed, but also is great for back stillage and sour mash use for the next batch.
Fantastic. I mean, I feel like those are words of wisdom for whiskey production in general. So thank you, Gina. And then questions about nitrogen. How is it going into the tanks? Is it frozen? Is it liquid? In whatever scenario it's in, how is that affecting the temperature?
So I know they're adding it at different times, different temperatures, and Amy's actually going to dive into this tomorrow as part of her presentation of how much, yeast versus mash versus nitrogen and what times really affects their yields. And, she's doing tests along the way to see if the fermentation is getting started on time, et cetera, et cetera. And so she's going to dive into that tomorrow specifically. And so we'll just leave that for her to answer.
Fantastic. And this is going to bring us to our last one from the mash bill and fermentation section. Darian, I see you have a question about yeast in here, but I have a strong feeling Dr. Don is going to address that for you in the future. So is there an average fermentation time for Hiram Walker whiskeys, or does it just vary like brand to brand, grain to grain?
In my understanding, we're looking at, could be up to 72 hours, but could be as low as 40 hours. And that's really dependent. Again, Amy could dive into this tomorrow in more detail, but it's really dependent on how quickly the fermentation is getting started and then how fast it's happening and the alcohol is starting to be produced.
And again, I think Amy will cover tomorrow. I believe the corn goes a little bit longer than the smaller grains from the rye, wheat, and barley.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And now we're moving into distillation. So taking a two-part question about the column stills, turning it into one question. Is there a specific number of plates that's in each column still, or is it different from still to still? And then also, how often do you have to replace those things, or just generally have the stills repaired?
Well, the distillery shuts down twice a year, I believe, right, Dave, for cleaning? And we should ask Amy, I think it's for a week to clean. And that video footage, Dave was there, with the camera crew filming all this beautiful video footage that we got, but he was lucky enough to be there on a week that Amy was cleaning the still. So otherwise you can't open those doors up. That's very rare. So, that really happens twice a year. And, all that copper sulfate that's kind of collecting on the copper, it has to be cleaned off, and that copper has to be revived. So.
Well, I'm glad we caught Amy on a good week so we could see inside. So for the second distillation in the double column still process, 94 to 95 ABV would be considered sellable as vodka in the US and EU. Is that the case in Canada as well?
I believe that the vodka regulations in Canada are the same, but I don't work on vodka, so I would have to double check that. But Dave, you might know.
We can ask Dr. Don, and I don't work on the vodka, so I'm not sure. And I do remember him last time I was at the distillery. Something came up because we make some vodkas for people there and ourselves, and apparently some of the rules and regulations for Canada did change. So ask that question again with Dr. Don. Amy probably can answer it, but I think Amy's got a lot of questions to answer already.
Yeah, I would love for her to want to hang out with us again. She's going to be like, oh my gosh, everybody wants to know everything. Maybe she finds her like next mentee through this program, because like what a dream that would be to get to work with Amy every day. So these next two questions are both about basically cuts and like heads, tails, hearts, ABV. So how do the column stills get rid of the foreshots during distillation? And are the ABV outputs of the single column and the pot stills the max you can get off of them?
Well, the first question, I know that Amy is going through that a bit tomorrow, so we'll leave that one for her. But the second question, no, it's not the max. You can almost always do more, right? But it's really where you want to capture, how slow can you do the distillation, and where do you want to capture the concentrated flavors? And
keep in mind too, I mean, this is something you just never really think about as someone who doesn't work in this industry. Is for instance, 8 years ago when I started this job, we were selling our products in Canada and we were starting to sell in the US. And now we're selling our products in over 20 countries around the world, which is still small scale when you think of really big whiskey companies, but it's big for us. And all countries have different rules and regulations on what is allowed, including Canada and US. So we have to, it's not hard for Gina and I, but for Amy and Dawn and everyone at the distillery, we've got to make sure we're making a consistent product that will fit all rules and regulations of where we're selling into.
Mm-hmm. And I know Dr. Don told me one time off the double column still, he's like, honestly, by regulation, we could go higher in Canada, but because the US is our biggest customer, that's really the cutoff point. And so we just stick to that so we can just make consistent product.
I can't imagine having to keep up with what's allowed where, and also trying to like do all of this beautiful work all the time. And we did have a question about the flavor difference for malted and unmalted grains that we'll get to before the last question, which is a question many people have had. But let's talk about grain first.
So what is the question? Which
the different flavor differences between malted grains and unmalted grains?
Oh, Don actually has a very strong opinion about this, and I've taken a few distillates, and I have some in my closet that if you go back and forth at 100% of those, those grains of a malted, let's say rye versus an unmalted rye, and just on the nose, but tasting it as well, the malted grains tend to have more of a like canned vegetable note to them. You know, almost like a tinny canned vegetable note on the nose, and also, you know, tasting it. And so, good or bad, or however you feel about that, that's just a major flavor comparison that he's been able to, of course, molecularly measure. But after, you know, you really sit side by side with them, you're like, oh wow, that is a very different note on the malted grains.
And I was going to say this happens very rarely, but it's not happened to me in North America, but traveling overseas where the first batch of Lot 40 in the 90s was released throughout Europe and UK, every so often I come across a crazy whiskey bar that's got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of whiskey, and you'll look and they'll have 2 Lot 40s on the menu, and I'm like, why do they have? And then you realize they have an original bottle from the 90s with 10% malted rye in there, and it was different casks as well, but what a difference. Like completely different whiskey to me. And as Gina said, like kind of vegetal notes, like not, I prefer the currant. That's my palate. I like the big rye notes, the vanilla and toffee, but yeah, it was just a very different whiskey.
I'd be willing to taste them side by side and provide notes for anyone who needs them. I'm just volunteering myself. And so the last question for today, I've seen it come up in the comments many times, is everybody wants to know, is there a single barrel? Will there be single barrels? If there are single barrels, what products they are going to be?
I mean, I can tell you what we just did, but it's not going to make anyone happy at this moment. But I have to advertise it tomorrow on Instagram, part of my job. Dr. Don's releasing the first ever single barrel of Lot 40 through Drop Collective, dropcollective.ca in Canada tomorrow. There are about 100 bottles of an 18-year-old cask strength Lot 40 from a single barrel, and it's being done by a lottery because there's no way to, like, how else do we have 100 bottles to sell? So that's, I mean, you can look through my Instagram, and I'll be doing it tomorrow. The Drop Collective is for participants in Ontario. So if you know anybody in Ontario, you could do it, but it's rare. I'm even fighting the good fight to get myself and Gina a bottle of each. It's not going to be easy to come by because of the response we've had. I wouldn't be surprised if you would start seeing some single barrels pop up in the near future, but we don't have any regularly out there single barreled whiskeys right now as of yet.
And we've had a lot of, you know, retailers especially who love single barrel programs and buy a barrel, etc. And some on-premise accounts as well. We've had a lot of interest in that. And as far as like every brand, of course, is going to have their own way of doing things. But, you know, JP Weiser's really kind of listened to what people were wanting, which was really a closer experience and a more personal experience with the whiskeys. And because JP Weiser's is really a brand that's known for blending and that iconic kind of traditional Canadian whiskey known as blended whiskey, they created a blending program for their select retailers. This year we have 9 retailers participating, 11 blends coming out, but they all were able to create their own blends with Dr. Don and Dave and I there to assist, but with Dr. Don really to sell as their own Canadian whiskey blend, which is, it's called Signature Series. It's a really special program. I think it's pretty cool because you really get to understand the blending process, and that's really the heart of Canadian whiskey.
Yeah.
I was going to say, that sounds like a dream.
It's the first time that we know of that has been done with a Canadian whiskey. And yes, now the Canadian viewers are going to be sending me messages going, why can't we do that? And to anyone that wonders why we can't do that, it's our laws. We wouldn't be able to bring people here in Ontario to make their own whiskeys and then these are being sold at single retailers. So they're creating their own blend and selling it. We have the LCBO, which is the government-controlled liquor board. So not possible. But yes, in the US, it's a very special experience we've been doing the last couple of years of them creating their own blends of Canadian whiskey.
Well, you know what is super legal though, because we do have some Canadians. So like Brian, like Killen, friends, if y'all want to get on this 100 bottle release, there do happen to be 100 students. Everybody can chip in on Venmo. We can get this thing done. So,
well, we as a marketing thing, they released like, what was it, Jim? Did they do 18 bottles just to kick it off a few weeks ago? And like they went like that. So we're expecting, Dawn and I will be announcing everything on our Instagram tomorrow. I mean, it's worth putting your name in. The worst thing that can happen is you don't get it. Like,
and the best thing that can happen is you do get it.
I was going to say, I'm telling my friends to do it. And I'm like, if you don't want it, I'll buy it off you. Like, if you get it, like, you get it. Like,
you're just like, it's like one of those things where you're like signing up, you're like your cousins and like aunts, and they're like, what? And you're like, I signed you up. You didn't even have to do anything. I'll come pick it up from you. Don't worry about it. Well, this has been just lovely. I feel like if we keep staying here talking about this blending program, we're just going to keep having questions about doing the blending program. So before we get too far into that, I will give all of you your afternoon back. But first, I have to say stuff to you before the stream ends, because that's what we do around these parts. And as soon as this document decides it's going to scroll up, I'll start saying those things. All right, here we go. So first of all, thank you so much to Dave and Gina for another fabulous and incredibly informative class. And thanks to all of you watching for being with us. If you are one of our 100 students, do not forget you have a class on Zoom tomorrow. We will see you there. If you enjoyed this class, smash that like or love button, show some love in the comments, tell Dave and Gina thank you for all of the fabulous information. If you would like to see more classes like this, then just go ahead and toss a follow on this Facebook page, whether the one you're looking at is Camp Run Amok or Portland Cocktail Week. We do classes on both, doesn't matter. Or you can head over to our sister YouTube channel at youtube.com/PDXCW. We are also on Instagram at Camp Run Amok, where you can find out what we're doing next, which is closing the Camp Run Amok 2022 applications at 11:59 p.m. Eastern tonight. And Dave and Gina, is there any accounts that you would love the fine people to follow to keep up with you, what you're doing?
I think they're up there already. At Gina Fossitt, at Dave Mitton.
Oh, I'm glad these glasses are on my face because I can't see anyway, but they look nice. Well, everybody have a wonderful Wednesday, and we will see you back here next week where we're finally going to answer all of those maturation questions.